So your opponent plays the Italian game and you have a choice. The solid Giuoco Piano with bishop c5 or the two knights defense with knight f6. Which one should black play? Well, my name is Coach Dennis. I'm a USCFNM. I'm also a chess journalist and professional coach, and I'm here to help answer that question as best I can. Clearly, both moves are very playable up to and through Super GM level. Among the strongest players in the world who prefer bishop c5, we have Anand, Vladimir Kramnik, Gukesh, and among those who have tended to prefer knight f6, you've got Nepomniachtchi, Firouzja, and Dubov. But even most of those guys switch it up from time to time. Most players at that level are somewhere in the middle. Magnus Carlsen in particular is almost exactly 50-50. When we realize that the top computers all use these two moves more or less interchangeably, it's pretty clear that there's no big difference in move quality. And if you take a look at the evaluation with Stockfish or other top chess engines, that's exactly what you'll find. Also, these two moves often transpose, as we'll see later on. So at that point, we could say, questions answered. It's a tie. Both of these moves are good. Video over, we solved the case. And the real Italian game is the friends we made along the way or something corny like that. I'm not here to do that because I want to help you make a decision between these two moves, and I should give you the pros and the cons of each one, as well as my personal opinion. I think that if I'm making a video that's X versus Y, two different options, I should at least give you my leaning or reasons why somebody might lean one direction or the other. Before getting to the differences between these two moves, I do want to mention quickly that this is the video version of a blog post that I've made on both chess.com and Lichess, going into a good bit more detail on this question. So if you want to look a bit further, feel free to check those out. And as always, that will be linked in the description and the pinned comment, as well as my coaching profile in case you're interested in me helping you improve your chess. Now, clearly, the question here is not really about which one is better. They're both obviously strong. The question is more about which is most practical for you and for human players with the black pieces. So let's start with a Giuoco Piano move order with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, let's say bishop c4, bishop c5, so this is the Giuoco Piano. And the most popular way for white to play at a high level is very quietly. Some order of d3, c3, a slow setup. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's say c3, knight f6, d3, and this is the Giuoco Pianissimo. Black most often goes d6 here. They could also start with a6 or even a5, and those are next moves that black would consider. Moving the a-pawn is often an idea to give this bishop more squares to retreat to. Sometimes black even goes h6 and can hint at g5 if white is especially slow or careless. Otherwise, black will castle short, maybe consider bishop e6 to trade off these bishops, and you have very quiet middle games ahead. Now, the key thing to note about the Giuoco Pianissimo is that it can easily be reached from either move order. So backing up to the position where we played bishop c5 to go into the Giuoco Piano, black can also play the move knight f6, which is the two knights defense, and this could easily transpose into the Giuoco Pianissimo, because if white plays the most popular move at a high level anyway, which is d3, then bishop c5 leads to the exact same position after white plays c3. And even if white doesn't play c3 here, it's very likely that white will play c3 at some point. Or maybe white could play with knight c3, very popular at the club and scholastic levels, and this can also be reached from bishop c5 on move 3. So lots of quiet ways that white can play, which could happen with either the Giuoco Piano or the two knights, and they're very likely to transpose in those cases. One little deviation black does have is after d3, black could play bishop e7 instead of bishop c5, and some of the grandmasters prefer to play this way. Not going to focus on that today. I'm focusing on the independent lines that could happen after either bishop c5 or knight f6. So let's start by considering, after the move bishop c5, the Giuoco Piano, whether there are any interesting ways that white can avoid the Giuoco Pianissimo, any sharper ways that white can play that could put pressure on black. And some of them revolve around exploiting this bishop on c5, which looks like a really well-placed piece. But this bishop can be hit by a pawn coming to d4 or a pawn coming to b4, and that actually is the origin of two gambits that white has in this position. So one of them is the Evans gambit with the move b4, and this is a very sharp variation. It's a very swashbuckling, romantic type opening that leads to a lot of sacrifices, so you do want to be aware of this. It is a kind of popular pet opening among a certain subset of players. After the move I would recommend, which is bishop takes b4, white has c3. And I would say there are two moves that I would investigate here. Bishop a5, which is the sort of old main line, and the other is bishop e7. So pick one, study it, learn it. It might take you a bit. The reality is that this gambit is known to be equal, but again, it leads to very rich, crazy positions, so just be aware of this opening. A long time ago, over a decade ago, I was a class player about 1500, and a friend of mine played another crazy gambit against me in this position. My opponent castled, and I played knight f6, which is the best move, and then white played d4, which is a move that I didn't think made a lot of sense because it seems like I have too many things controlling that square. So I played pawn takes d4, but in fact this might already be a little bit inaccurate. White played e5, and this led to what's called the Max Lang attack, where I lost very, very quickly. Going back, instead of taking with the pawn, I would highly recommend for you to take with the bishop, and this leads to the so-called Koltanowski gambit. If knight takes d4, which is the main line, white has two ways to play. One of them is bishop g5, the other is f4, d6, takes, then bishop g5, and in both cases, white has reasonable compensation for a pawn, but black is doing okay, and maybe black is actually a little bit better with best plays. So what I would say is, don't stress about this opening. It's not going to come up that often, but it is something to be aware of. So white has two major gambits that they can play against bishop c5. For the bishop c5 player, we have the Evans gambit, we have the Koltanowski gambit as areas of focus, but the number one independent idea that white could try that we need to be aware of is an immediate c3 and d4. Now, Gioacchino Greco, whose name I had to practice pronouncing for this video, played this idea like 400 years ago and counting. And when he played it, he would play c3, knight f6, and d4 right away. And after pawn takes, he would just take back with the pawn and achieve this large center and then worry about it later. Black needs to play bishop b4 check in this position. All of this is almost forced from black. And now there are a couple different ways that white can get out of this check that make sense. But I will say that for the most part, unless your opponent plays like queen d2 or something, I think that knight takes e4 is a good next move for black against whichever way white chooses to block the check. Now, Greco in his games usually played knight c3 here, and this leads to a sharp line. You take on e4 and they castle. And I'm not going to get into the theory of this position, but you should know that bishop takes c3 is the correct choice here. And there's some theory after this. It's a tricky line, but it's known to be okay for black. White has reasonable compensation for one pawn, but not anything overflowing. If we go back a little bit, there is also the move bishop d2, and there are several ways for black to equalize against this. You could take the bishop and then play with d5. That's, I think, a perfectly fine way to go. And the other thing you could do is, again, you can play knight takes e4, and this leads to a well-known dead equal endgame with best play. So I wouldn't really fear this c takes d4 move that Greco used to play all those years ago, even though it's still roughly equal. I think the more interesting thing is what happens if white doesn't take back on d4 in this position. And in fact, white does have two reasonable ways not to take back on d4. There is a weird sideline here, the Dubov variation, some have called it, with b4. And that has caught on a bit lately. But I will say you're not likely to face that unless your opponent is either very hip to modern theory or just a complete, like, chessable bro. So let's not worry about that for now. But e5 is a big main line, and this will come up in your games, and it's definitely a reasonable line for white that fights for a slight space advantage. Black should probably play with d5 here. And now this bishop can go to either b5 or e2, the latter of which is Aronion's favorite, and then black will move the knight. For example, bishop b5, knight e4, pawn takes, and then usually black goes bishop b6, bishop b4 check also may be possible. And these positions have a decent bit of theory in them now, and you should know a thing or two, but I wouldn't spend too much time memorizing theory. I would look at the games here, because this type of position, if you play the Giuoco Piano, will come up at some point. So now let's turn our focus towards knight f6, which is the two knights defense, and let's talk about the differences between this and the Giuoco Piano with bishop to c5. Now the first and most obvious difference is that there's no bishop on c5, and that might seem stupidly simple, but it does mean that there's not going to be an Evans gambit, and some of the c3 d4 lines that I mentioned earlier aren't going to hit anything. In fact, there's another big difference here, which is that the knight on f6 is hitting the pawn on e4, which limits white's options, because if white plays c3 here, black will just take the pawn on e4, and now black is ready to push d5, and black is already the one fighting for an advantage here. Also, if white castles here, black can play knight takes e4 with a good position. Now, white can probably get their pawn back if they really want to, but black already, again, is the side I would prefer, and white does not seem to have anything particularly dangerous in this position. So knight f6 limits white's options because white either needs to defend the pawn on e4 or white needs to make some type of bigger threat against black somewhere else on the board. As far as defending the pawn on e4 goes, I've seen queen e2, but I'm not super worried about that. And knight c3 allows the fork trick with knight takes e4, which is something you should be aware of via the four knights order anyway, but just an important theme in e4, e5 positions. There are some potential drawbacks to playing the two knights against the Italian, and one of them is that the d4 square is not well controlled. So white can actually push d4 right now, and this leads to a transposition directly into the Scotch gambit after pawn takes pawn on d4. Now, some people don't like dealing with this line, but I think that it's kind of a nothing burger, not because it's not fine for white, it is, but because of the fact that you're going to have to deal with the Scotch gambit anyway. Because if white plays the Scotch through the regular move order, then after you take on d4, they could play bishop c4 and you get the Scotch gambit, and knight f6 is the main line. So I don't see that as being a point against the two knights defense, because it transposes into something that you would have to deal with elsewhere in your repertoire no matter what. So if the Scotch gambit is not such a big problem, what is? Well, I think the biggest issue for black and the two knights is that the queen on d8 does not see the g5 square like the queen would in Giuoco Piano. And as a result of that, white can play the move knight g5, which threatens a big fork on f7 and all kinds of devastation to black. And this is the part where I mentioned that I recently made a video and a big project about this position, and of course I will put that on screen somewhere if I figure out how to do that, but I'll give you a very abbreviated version here. Basically, black needs to play d5 to block this bishop, and after pawn takes, if black takes back on d5, that allows multiple very aggressive attacking options from white that I don't think you want to deal with. So black needs to sacrifice a pawn, and a lot of players don't have the bravery to do that, but there are a couple good ways to do it. There's the move b5, which is the Ulvestad variation. I talked about that in the last video. And there's also knight a5, leading to some more mainline positions, which I analyzed in depth. No matter what, though, I don't want to make it seem simple. You can't just hand wave away the move knight g5. This is a big main line. It wins material for white more or less by force. So you're going to have to do more studying and preparation here than against any of the independent lines that I mentioned against the Giuoco Piano. I think it's time to reach a few conclusions about the differences and the pros and cons of each. I would say both moves, the Giuoco Piano, the two knights, bishop c5, knight f6, are 100% playable. They often transpose, and there's not really any difference in quality between them. They're both, of course, sound. Bishop c5 is a little bit more on the solid side. Knight f6, that takes a bit more risk because it's a gambit if white plays the move knight g5. And then the other thing I would say is that, as mentioned before, bishop c5 gives you more areas of focus. That is to say, white has more different things they can do, but they're not that critical mostly. With knight f6, there's one big area to focus on, which is quite critical, although black is fine in all cases. Now, the argument in favor of bishop c5, the Giuoco Piano, is kind of the following. The two knights defense is very theoretical, and the main lines after knight g5 in particular might require you to learn a lot if your opponents are pretty strong. And then also the issues with bishop c5, that is to say, the Evans gambit, the Koltanowski gambit, the Greco lines, I would not say those are as critical as the knight g5 lines in the two knights. And finally, bishop c5 leads to a bunch of different types of positions and gives you more variety, which is not a bad thing for a learning or improving chess player who's just coming up. You just want to see lots of different types of positions and get experience. Bishop c5 is a great move. Now, all of that is very compelling, and it was part of the reason why I played bishop c5 for most of my career, if you could call it that, as a club and class level player rising the ranks maybe a decade ago. Today, if I had to choose, I think I would choose the two knights. But that's not because I think the two knights is any better. It isn't. I mean, the reality is that these two openings are equal quality and it's just a matter of taste. But my tastes have changed over the years, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that I'm a lot more comfortable playing positions down material for activity than I used to be. I think also it appeals to me that knight f6 really does just have one huge independent problem, which is knight g5, and you could easily specialize in something here or just get to know the positions really well, and then you'll get them a lot. You'll get them almost every time that the opponent doesn't go for the Scotch Gambit or the Giuoco Pianissimo. Because after d5 and takes, you could just make b5, which is a sharp, sort of trendy, modern line, your main line, and just do that and learn a lot of theory along the way, and it could be fun. It's very chaotic. Or you could play knight a5, go for the main lines, and then after bishop b5 check, learn some real theory, and that could pay dividends in the long run. Over time, you'll get better at playing those lines. Now, the difference is, after bishop c5, the opponent can do all kinds of different things. The many different options here for white, including within the Greco variation with c3 and d4, mean that you'll often be entering the opponent's pet lines, where they might have more experience than you. So they're getting the Evans Gambit if they play that, or the Koltanowski or the Greco. They're getting that all the time against bishop c5, and you're not. And you're only getting it a tiny portion of your games, even in the Italian. And so I do think that's a little bit of a practical benefit to playing the move knight f6 over bishop c5. But as mentioned, that is just my opinion. And I definitely don't think that that's an objective truth, because there are plenty of very strong chess players who disagree with me completely on this topic. And I would be really interested in hearing the opinions of those of you who are title players or very seasoned tournament players in the comments. Do you have a preference between the two knights defense or the Giuoco Piano? And has it changed over the years? Because mine has personally. Now, if you enjoyed this video, it's possible that my previous video about how to face the fried liver attack, very relevant to the topic I just discussed, could also be helpful for you. And in addition to that, there is also the lead chess study that goes with that video and the blog post that goes with this video to give some additional context. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a tremendous day. Take care.